Hey everybody, welcome back to Caveman Security, where we try to make cybersecurity simple. So, I'm your host, Robbie, and today I'm going to teach you a little bit about API security. This is a portion of cybersecurity that I've been really working on because for a little bit about my background, as I'm a software engineer, I also started doing like web application testing, mobile application testing, and AI application testing. So this is something that I'm really passionate about, and I would really like to teach you guys about API and kind of what it is and how it can kind of be beneficial for you and the attackers. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's talk about it. What is API security? So API, think of it as like a messenger. So you ask for food, the messenger brings back the food. As you can see in my illustration here, the guy saying, hey, go get me some food, and the guy does it. This is API. Which is true if you're looking for like information, like user information, database information, whatever that API is configured to, it will retrieve it and bring it back. So this is really, really important because a lot of times we don't realize how much effort is going into this type of work and what it can actually reveal to us. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into that. So first off, let's talk about what REST API is. So I'm not going to go too deep into like the acronym, but it is like a modern HTTP request, which allows us to do a few things. We can do our GET request, which is to like retrieve information, POST, which is like to send information. So think about when you're logging into a website, or maybe you're adding in some information to a website. You're gonna do a lot of posting, right? Maybe you want to update. So maybe like you have a new profile picture, or maybe you're updating your bio in a website. That's going to be like a PUT request because you're changing the data, right? And finally, we have a delete request, which is to remove data. So these are kind of the functions you're going to play with a lot when you're dealing with API. And honestly, you should get familiar with them because for me, like when I'm using tools like Postman, Burp Suite, Kaido, I'm living in these requests a lot. And these requests, they look very scary, but it's something that we can work on and improve, okay? So this is just kind of a brief, high-level overview about what is REST API. All right, so think about API as them being everywhere. They're in our food delivery, they're in our banking apps, social media, games, healthcare apps, streaming services, they're everywhere. And it's nice because these web or APIs, they're so nice because you don't see the pages loading too much. You don't see a lot of the back-end work like you would with traditional websites. Like with traditional websites, you would see the page load from one page to another. But with APIs, it's doing a lot of the background work, and the website just updates. It doesn't load or do anything special. So whenever you're going to the store, for instance, let's say you're going to Amazon, when you click the cart, that's an API call. Because what it's doing is it's saying, okay, this person wants this. We're going to put it in the cart. But you don't see any pages loading, but you do see like an update to the current page. So a lot of people like this because it's maybe less friction when it comes to like traffic, and it's not as annoying as like website loading, stuff like this. Okay. So next, think about mobile apps. I mentioned mobile apps specifically because I think a lot of times people don't realize that mobile apps, AI apps, they have API. I think a lot of people are really confused about that because they sit there and say, well, it's on my phone. There shouldn't be any web interface or whatever. But the reality is a lot of mobile applications today, they're actually like hybrid. So sometimes, yes, there are native apps like made from Kotlin or Java or Swift, but most of the times they also have a lot of web interfaces, right? So there's going to be some API functionalities. So as you can see in my example, we have our mobile app. It has an API and it's reaching like a server or database. So especially when you think about logging into an app, right? Like let's say like you're logging into Google, maybe you have like MyFitnessPal, whatever. Whenever you log in, that's an API call, right? Or when you're authenticating yourself, that's an API call. So a lot of these things we never see in the front end, but in the back end, there's a lot of things working. So be mindful about that because when you're thinking about, well, is my app secure? Well, why don't you capture some network traffic and see what happens? You'd be surprised, really. Okay, so let's talk about the front end versus back end. So we talked about this just for a second ago. So the front end is what you see. So if you're adding something to your card, if you're logging in, you don't see a lot of movement. You just kind of see updates, right? The page just kind of updates magically. Or that's what we think, right? It's like magic. But the reality is there's a lot of work in the back end. This is kind of my hidden cave, caveman situation where you look at the network traffic, you see the processes in the background. There's a lot of stuff going on, especially when you have like multiple API calls and you're, maybe working with like microservices and different things. Multiple processes are firing at once. So as you can see in like my graphical representation, right, kind of these 2 or 3 strands are hitting this server. And that's really the truth because a lot of traffic is moving and it's just very intense. So think about the API as a tunnel between the front and the back end. So a lot of times when we're working as software developers, maybe like when I was a back end developer, I would go ahead and develop my API call or my API function, and then the front end developer would have to configure that to match the front end. So maybe it was some sort of like e-commerce, maybe in my case, it was like an AI microservice, so they needed to validate the AI call, or they needed to verify the chat with AI. So they were able to do that on the front end, but my back end was what was making most of that work, right? So it's very, very important to think about. Okay, so a lot of times the tricky thing for attackers is API exposes business logic. So when we think about like software engineering, we don't really think about business too much. Unless you have any sort of job experience with software engineering, you won't know much about this. But when we're developing software, we're developing for a business, right? So a lot of times we want to say, okay, how does this work? Can this person buy this? Can this person download this? Whatever it could be. So what API does is it allows us to see this information. So you're not going to see it on the front end as a basic end user. You will never see the business logic. You'll just kind of go, okay, I'm going to add this to cart, check out, then I'm done. That's business logic, but you don't really see it too much. But on the back end, you see everything. So you see the discounts, you see the payments, you see the amount, you see the orders, you see everything. And this is really, really dangerous because if you don't have these secure or kind of have permissions on them, it can be devastating because you may just give out so much information and you'll be in trouble. So small example, when I was working on a web application challenge for like a pizza delivery, right? Actually, I was able to capture network traffic and I can see, my name, my phone number, the credit card, the amount, and that's dangerous. So if you're an attacker who's just kind of sitting on the network or kind of sitting in between the traffic between the application and you, there's a high chance that your information could be stolen. That's why when you look at websites that say, oh, we have secure checkout, you better make sure that that's a legitimate thing because a lot of times, yeah, your information can get caught. And if there's not any encryption involved, well, then we're in trouble. Okay, so think about that the next time you go to a store. Yeah, it may be at that one specific store and that store looks a little sketchy. Maybe you really want it, but think for a split second and think, is the risk really worth it? Is someone going to snag the information? And if you feel like there's a slight chance that they will, don't do it. Okay? So why attackers love API? So API, it trusts too much. Anyone who can access like the website, like the URL or IP address, can do something with Postman or Burp Suite and ping that website, and they can retrieve information. Now, depending on the website, you may need like a JWT token or some sort of cookie, but for the most part, you can find a lot of information without that information. So that's why attackers love it. There's just too much information that can come out. A lot of times there's broken authentication. So even if you don't see it from one end, you can maybe go to another section of the website and still find some information, which is dangerous. So you kind of have to look and do like a full 360 of your security when it comes to your web application. Okay? Again, too much data exposure. For example, if you're going to like a website that maybe has a community section, right? And you can see other people's work or tools or whatever, then that API call is going to reveal, user 1, user 2, user 3, user 4, and not just their ID, but their email, their password, not even the password, but their username, email, project, URLs, whatever is in that parameter, it's going to come out. And that can be extremely dangerous because then you can just take all that, copy it, post it, paste it somewhere, and then you can go ahead and do some other ethical hacking or black hat hacking, whatever you need to do outside of that. So very, very dangerous. And then, of course, a lot of times you can find a lot of predictable requests. So, for example, a lot of times people will always go to /administrator or /admin, and they will try to tinker around with that because it's easy to follow, it's easy to look at, so people do it. And a lot of times people don't really lock down their web applications like they should, so it's very easy to manipulate these web apps. Okay? So, just some key takeaways I want you to think about. APIs, they're everywhere. They're powerful. They're dangerous. They're invisible. And most importantly, they're heavily attacked. And I'm going to go take you through an example of a broken object level access attack today to show you what that is. So here's just a brief example of what we're going to do. So we see that the user is 1001. We're going to change it to something like 1002. Now I'm going to show you through a web application called Crappy, which is more real world, but it's going to show you what it's like to jump from one user to another. Okay, so guys, this is it for my explanation. So stay tuned for just a second and we will do the example. Alright guys, so let's go ahead and take a look at the Crappy web application. So what we want to do is we want to kind of take a look at a way to see if we can find some, user information, maybe kind of some dangerous stuff that we can find. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to refresh my location. And what that'll do is that'll do an API call. So again, when we remember APIs, we don't see anything moving on the front end. We just see everything on the back end. So let's go ahead and pull up Burp Suite for a minute. And we're going to see kind of a few things happening. So let's scroll down to our information. And we're going to look for our details and see if we can find anything interesting. Okay, so here we go. Is our kind of our Maps API. So this is kind of interesting. So we see that it's trying to upload some information, trying to tell us some stuff. Kind of interesting, right? So we see, okay, now here's our API call. So we see identity, API, version 2, vehicle. Now here we see this, kind of VIN number or kind of special number, right? So we see that this is actually the car ID. So kind of important here. So we see our longitude and latitude, our full name, our email. That's pretty dangerous, right? So one thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take this and we're going to put this in Repeater. So what Repeater is going to do is it's going to allow us to take this web app traffic and manipulate it a few times to see if we can find some information. But before we do that, I want to show you a little bit more things that will tell you something. So let's look at community for a moment. So if we travel over to community, we see a couple posts, robot, Hoga, whatever. So let's go back to our web application stuff. And we see again the community API version 2 post recent. So let's look at that. So again, here we see it again. We see our ID, which if you notice, it's kind of similar to our ID. So this is kind of interesting. We see title, content, email, very dangerous, vehicle ID, URL, stuff like this. So again, we see some information that we really shouldn't, right? So if we look back, we kind of say, okay, hey, this information matches kind of these other people's. So what we can do is we can copy one of them. So let's copy the robot one. So we're just going to copy the vehicle ID. And what should happen is we should be able to access that person's information. So let's go ahead and take out our current information. And let's see what happens. So now we've copied and pasted it. We're going to hit send. And okay, we came back to 200 okay, which if you ever get a 200 okay, that means that the information was accepted and everything was okay. So now we can see a few things. We can see that person's vehicle ID. We can see their name, email, their latitude, longitude. So that means I can find this car, find him, steal it, do a bunch of stuff, and this person's in trouble. Okay, so guys, this is just an example of BOA attacks and how dangerous they can be. Because one, they give out too much information, like, email, location, plus, you can kind of access things that you really shouldn't. And the funny thing is I have a JWT token, which means that it should only be accessed for my information. So the fact that I can access someone else's information is definitely a problem. So guys, hopefully you guys like this episode of Caveman Sec, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.